So, welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and Dr. Judd Burton is back, and we are going to talk about the Tower of Babel. Yeah, Judd, welcome.
hmm Thank you.
So, yeah, was it real? Is it a myth? I did a little bit of digging, and I'm pretty sure you have heard of this. It is called the Etemenanki ziggurat.
hmm
That is one of the highly contested contender. These ruins that might have been the Tower of Babel, and um, they found a tablet, and on that tablet there is a ziggurat.
hmm
I I forgot the name of this tablet, and Nebuchadnezzar is shown um, on that tablet next to the ziggurat. Do you think that might be possible?
Well, honestly, I don't think any of the potential locations in southern Mesopotamia are valid. Um, it's it's very convenient to look at um, the account of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, and because it's occurring in the land of Shinar, which is what the Hebrews called Samaria, or because it's happening in Mesopotamia, it's very convenient to locate all of the potential Tower of Babel locations in southern Mesopotamia, including the city of Babylon as a potential contender. Uh, and there are others who have argued that um, the Tower of Babel is a ziggurat found in the ancient Sumerian city of Eridu. Um, the problem with, and I understand it's a kind of lateral move from the text when you read the Genesis account, and then all of this is happening in Mesopotamia. So it would be a lateral move just in terms of text to situate it um, in southern Mesopotamia. And this probably goes back to uh, not just the text itself, but also the early archaeology that was done in Mesopotamia, let's say under the auspices of especially Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated a number of sites, including the city of Ur.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a host of these sort of golden age archaeologists who are doing all of this work in Mesopotamia, and they're uncovering, like the Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh epic, and they're finding all of these similarities with the flood epic and the Bible and the Genesis narrative. And so um, it was a it was a time when archaeology was extremely well funded by interested parties, just largely because of the biblical anchor, but the antiquities that were coming out of that place uh, certainly made it a worthwhile endeavor. But I say all that just to say that it's a little too convenient to locate the Tower of Babel in southern Mesopotamia. Quite frankly, I believe that after the work that I've done on the issue, I believe that the Tower of Babel would have still been in what the Hebrews considered Shinar, Mesopotamia, but it was northern Mesopotamia, far northern Mesopotamia, uh, into the lands of like Eastern Turkey and Armenia, the edges of which still would have qualified as northern Mesopotamia. Um, but in addition to the convenience of making it a Mesopotamian ziggurat, you run into the problem of the language phenomenon, the this confusion of the languages, as the biblical text um, recounts. Uh, and people can read this in Genesis 10 and 11. Um, but not only is there a profusion of language, but there's a new languages, but there's a an outburst of ethnogenesis. You have all these new societies that are moving into different parts of the old world during this time, and so situating the Tower of Babel in southern Mesopotamia in the fourth millennium, third millennium BC doesn't make a whole lot of sense linguistically because there's not we don't I mean there are three or four languages that are spoken in Mesopotamia about that time. Nothing on the order of magnitude that's recounted in what happens in Genesis after the building of the tower itself. I've come to believe that the that linguistics, more more so linguistics and not as much archaeology, gives us a better clue as to where the Tower of Babel would have been built and when it would have been built. Now, I've already pushed the potential boundary up to the north into, let's say, southeastern Turkey, and so I think that the timing, the dating that most people defer to uh, in the Tower of Babel, I think is off as well, simply because of the linguistic uh, potential. And what I mean by that is that between in the between 6000 BC and 4000 BC, there is a linguistic phenomenon known as the Proto-Indo-European language shift. And it occurs in this region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, uh, all the way down to what would have been southeastern Anatolia, southeastern Turkey, Armenia, northern Iran. Um, the Proto-Indo-European language shifts created 90% plus of the languages spoken in Europe and Asia, and even some stragglers in the Middle East. So here we're talking about hundreds of language families and thousands of languages out of this, uh, again, very linguistically chartable phenomenon. There have been several scholars who have demonstrated that this happened. Um, J.P. Mallory, in his In Search of the Indo-Europeans, lays this thesis out. The late Marius Gimbutas believed much the same thing about the Proto-Indo-European language shift. Not that it had any, in their mind, not that it had anything to do with Babel. Um, I'm just saying that it makes more sense linguistically to move the side of Babel to the north and push back the dating of when the tower would have been built to this window between 6000 BC and 4000 BC, because it makes more linguistic sense when you reason in the so-called confusion of languages and the various ethnicities that are spawned out of this event. Um, but Babel was not just a physical structure. I'm convinced, as the text lays it out, it was a structure, but it was also a working. There's a ritual at work. Um, Otherwise, I don't think you would have seen I don't think you would have seen Yahweh and the Prince of Heaven getting involved in trying to stop the completion, the telos, as it were, of the actual both the actual tower and the ritual itself. And so, long story short, I think that most scholars are looking in the wrong place in the wrong time for Babel.
So, in other words, you would locate it more in the direction of Turkey.
Yes, specifically southeastern Turkey, southeastern Anatolia.
hmm Okay. Um, yeah, there seems to be a lot going on in that area.
Indeed, not the least of which are the Tas Templar culture discoveries beginning with Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's ancient Anatolia right now is very archaeologically generous at this point, and we're finding out a lot about. Um, we're having to reassess our preconceived notions of when civilization emerged and what exactly civilization was and what were the reasons that civilization emerged. Even the late Klaus Schmidt, when he commented on Göbekli Tepe, he said it it it's a city that doesn't behave like a city. You know, for the longest time, most scholars subscribe to Vera Gordon Child's Neolithic Revolution hypothesis that it took agriculture to be set first in order for cities to emerge. But um, at the Tas Templar sites in Göbekli Tepe, it seems that religion was the main reason for the building of these complexes, and it was agriculture was an epiphenomenon. It was a byproduct of having to feed these copious amounts of people. So yeah, that's one example of how how crucial this part of the world is becoming in understanding our most ancient civilized past. And I think to to some degree, the story of Babel is a kind of bookend on that.
Hmm. Um, when we take the biblical story at face value, some people say it it happened because people were supposed to spread out all over the world, and this project of the tower was, um, yeah, counterproductive. Would you agree with that?
I think so because the implication in the text is that again, this is not just a it's not just a monument. Yeah, there's a lot of hubris and arrogance involved in the building of it, particularly if Nimrod was in charge of this kingdom, which he seems to be, and there's a side discussion there about Nimrod and Gilgamesh being the same person. Um, but the entire act of building the tower itself is not unlike other kinds of monuments like ziggurats and pyramids. They're mountain effigies, but they're also temples or these places where ancients believed that the gods dwelt at the summit of these mountains and also artificial mountains. And so clearly, there's a physical architectural structure that's being built here, but the focus of it was, or the impetus behind it was the ritual part of the building and what was involved in it. As as post Enlightenment modern peoples, we typically don't think of um, mythology and ritual and engineering and architecture riding in the same cart because we like to intellectually compartmentalize everything. But that's not really how ancient and prehistoric peoples thought. And so the act of building the tower was part of the ritual, but the working behind it was, again, as I said, the implication in the biblical text is that this is an attempt to assault heaven to gain back entrance to heaven, entrance to heaven that had been blocked by some of these um, entities that became the gods of the ancient world. In other words, they're trying to do that. I think that in some ways, and I argued this in a book with Dr. Aaron Judkins, is that something similar to this happened at the Toss Templar sites like Göbekli Tepe. Um, but that's why I say that Babel is sort of a bookend to that period. It's sort of the last ditch attempt of Nimrod's kingdom to try and regain access that these reprobate entities had lost. Um, so while most people are scrambling to find which ziggurat is it? Is it the ziggurat in Eridu or Uruk, or was it one of the early ones that the Ubaid culture built? No, I think we have to look farther north or we have to look farther back, and there are good reasons to do that. Um, in this case, I'm basically just letting the philology, the linguistics, do the demonstration because as I pointed out, the Proto-Indo-European language shift makes more sense to me as this phenomenon in language and ethnogenesis is what the author of Genesis is trying to describe, and it happens much earlier than most scholars, most people are willing to concede.
Mhm. So, like with many other biblical stories, we have similar stories. I'm not saying identical, but similar stories
Sure.
around the world. Yeah. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
since in Hinduism, we have a story that the Asuras uh,
Mm-hmm.
were those were demons, and they built a giant fire altar of
Mm-hmm.
to reach the heaven. And then the god Indra intervened, and the way he did that was he himself put a brick into that construction.
Mm-hmm.
And once it was finished, he removed it, which made it crumble and killed all the demons.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm?
Yeah. Well, I think I think the same way that Atlantis and well, the deluge, the flood itself, and in this case, the Tower of Babel. I think what we're looking at is shared memory. They're just shared memories of the same event that these different cultures are recounting. Um, Really, I mean, the first person that sort of made this click for me um, was Graham Hancock. I remember reading Fingerprints of the Gods when I was a freshman in college, and it just sort of upended the historiographical process that I was learning as a historian in training, but in a good way because it forced us to ask some questions that I think the academic community was not really asking at the time. Um, but yeah, in the case of these similarities in stories, the, a lot of them are, to my mind, as a historian and an anthropologist, they're shared cultural memories. They're real events that happened of such significance that they seared themselves into our collective cultural memory, and that's why there's similarity of them, not just in the old world, but also the new world. So we're talking about localized events that had global repercussions.
Mm.
And the stories of those traveled as people moved around the world. Um, and another thing that modern academics do is underestimate the ambulatory nature of prehistoric and ancient peoples. That they didn't necessarily just stay in one place. Sometimes they traveled, and sometimes they traveled extensively, and just completely uprooted and moved their society to another place altogether, or moved over an ocean. Um, so as these peoples went into different parts of the world, they retained the core memory of these very strange but culturally significant events, and you can lay these stories out in a matrix and find these similarities, and that's not by accident, that's by design, because there are people remembering these events, and I think that the Tower of Babel is one of those.
Hmm. Um, you just mentioned a little while ago that the ancients were convinced that the gods, the little g
Hmm.
gods, are living on mountains.
Hmm.
So could that have to do with the fact that the fallen angels landed on Mount Hermon?
I think so. And I argued as much in my book Interview with the Giant that um, all of these pyramidal monuments that we have around the world, whether they're the Egyptian pyramids or ziggurats or Angkor Wat in Cambodia, or the pyramids in Mesoamerica and South America, the mounds in the Mississippi River Valley. They're all mountain effigies, and I think that they point to this event that occurred on Mount Hermon, um, that exists in a variety of apocryphal accounts, not the least of which is the Book of Enoch, but you also have allusion to it in uh, Jubilees and the Book of Jasher and the Genesis Apocryphon. Some of those are fragmentary examples, but the the narrative is very similar. Um, so yeah, to my mind, that's sort of the template for the the sacred mountain, um, in a way. But and it makes sense when you look at a lot of the pantheons of gods
Hmm.
who dwelt on mountains. Um, they're conceived as being anthropomorphic in form, but their motivations and personalities were they sort of represented the best and the worst qualities of humanity. They are quite capricious entities, and not always. Rarely did they ever serve the interest of humans, but they served their own interest. And this bears out with the personalities of the Watchers, the fallen angels, and in Enoch, and certainly in descriptions of the gods of the nations that you run into throughout the Old Testament. But it wasn't just the ancient Hebrews that felt this way about their gods. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Vedic civilization, the Harappans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, they all recognized that their gods had motivations that were altogether their own, and they sort of were at Um, they were at the uncontrollable mercy of these supernatural forces, which they felt they had to constantly placate. And so this is an element that I think needs to be brought more to the fore in the story of the Tower of Babel. It's not written out explicitly, but it's definitely implicitly in the text, and that's probably because um, Moses didn't feel the need to. In the case of Genesis, Moses didn't feel the need to include that detail because his audience was already familiar with it. You know, we often forget that ancient literature, not just the Bible, but ancient literature was first and foremost always written to another audience. It wasn't written to us. It was written to an audience that already understood the cultural nuances um, of a given society that they lived in. Um, and so sometimes we're left to solve the mysteries of these gaps, cultural gaps in the narrative that we don't understand because we don't have the proper context in order to understand them.
Mm.
But a reading of the Babel account um, should definitely be put into the context of these of the idea that the gods occupied mountain summits, and this was a means by which they interacted with humans.
Um, when I look at these so-called gods, I mean,
Hmm.
we find all, as you said, the best and the worst of humanity. There are a couple of questions that I have had for a long time. I don't think they can be answered, um, to something that we would call reasonable doubt. Yeah. But
Hmm.
here are the questions that are running around in my head. When I look at their stories, you find infanticide, patricide, you find deception, murder, and what have you. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that to me sounds very, very, yeah, from our perspective, yeah, now it
Hmm.
sounds as if they are humans. But here's my other question. Is it possible that they introduced that type of behavior to us and we didn't have that before?
I think so.
Mm,
I think so. I think um, and there are a number of people who speak on pre-Adamic and Edenic and Atlantean peoples and civilizations that would by our time standards would be archaic, not just ancient. Um, yeah, but at some point there was this um incursion of these entities, and they forever changed the cultural trajectory that we were on. I think Mount Hermon is one of those places. I think potentially the site for Babel that I'm talking about is one of them. I think some of the Tos Templar sites, particularly Göbekli Tepe, point to this because for ostensibly for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, humans were hunter gatherers and horticulturalists, basically. And then 12,000 plus years ago, we start domesticating plants and animals and building megalithic structures. I mean, this is a 90-degree angle change in the cultural trajectory of humanity. Um, and I think it was introduced. Um, I like the way that Jared Diamond talks about, he doesn't talk about watchers. He's a materialist, but I do think his thought process is applicable. In his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, he talks about the clash between the old world and the new world, particularly the Spanish and the Inca in South America. And there were all of these factors in the old world that put the Spanish at an advantage that the new world just didn't have. Um, Metallurgy and uh, exposure to domesticated animals and their diseases, smallpox, anthrax, which inoculated, people over the millennia. Um, and these technologies and epidemiology were there because the continents in the old world, Europe and Asia, were long east to west. They didn't have to travel through greatly different landforms. Well, in the Americas, they're long north to south, and so it was harder for technologies and those sorts of things to travel north and they did, but it took longer. So that um, by way of factors like geography and metallurgy and epidemiology, the Spanish were in a place to rather easily defeat the Inca when they came in contact with them. Not because the Inca weren't brave, it's just that these were factors that happened millennia before these two peoples even met. If you take that model and look at the irrevocable change to native society in the Americas because of European contact, if you take that model and look at the incursion of the Watchers and their effect on humanity, something similar began. The only kind of the kind of cultural change that happens 12,000 plus years ago can only happen if a society is exerted on by an outside society. And there was nobody else on the planet. There was no human society uh, that could do the things that humans ended up doing uh, after this contact. And so that's architecture and ritual. But these entities, the Watchers and their progeny, even to a degree, the Nephilim and the Rephaim and all of the gigantic races, um, in a way, engineered culture and language at this point in time. And of course, that's going to, you know, you posited the possibility of things like genocide and infanticide and
Mm.
all of these monstrous practices came about in the wake of this contact, and I tend to think that that's the case.
Mhm.
Um, um, it's certainly, I mean, as a footnote to that, it works theologically because of the so-called fall of humanity, but it also works in a real, flesh and bone, nuts and bolts context too, where you've got, however people want to describe these entities, they had a tremendous impact on the way that human culture unfolded in the wake, and it's not only about growing crops and building megalithic structures. It's also, the bloodletting and bloodthirst that, quite frankly, um, were personality traits of yes, the Watchers, but especially their progeny, the Nephilim, who were blood drinkers and cannibals, and all of these entities, of course, set themselves up as the rulers and gods of people of the prehistoric and early antique worlds.
Mm. We have a similar development in more recent times. And what I mean by that is the following. For thousands of years, we usually used animals, predominantly horses, as a means of transport. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes combined with how do you call that? A wagon that you put behind the horse and then you sit on.
Sure.
So, so we do that for thousands of years. Yeah, nothing ever changes. And then around the time of World War One, a little bit earlier actually, and then bang, we are sitting in submarines, we are flying through the skies in
Mm-hmm.
we have different weaponry and on it goes. So,
Mm-hmm.
do you think something similar might have happened there that we just are not aware of it? Because I find that that jump pretty significant, or is it simply human ingenuity?
Oh, you mean that we go from
Yeah.
horse and buggy to
Mm.
landing on the moon in less than 100 years? Um, yeah, I do think something similar is happening. I do look because again, you don't see those kinds of leaps and changes in culture and technology without some sort of outside influence. And for us to basically have, for a few thousand years to have with some advancement, of course. But my gosh, there were people in my hometown of Merkel, Texas, in the 1930s that were still riding horses into town, and then less than 40 years later, we're launching rockets and landing on the moon. Um, I do believe that that is an indicator that there are these outside influences. How they're being contacted is a matter of some speculation, but I think it's some informed speculation, particularly when you have personalities like Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard doing their Babylon workings in Southern California. Jack Parsons was you know, he was a famous uh, scientist who basically started what would become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and then NASA. But he was also a devotee of Aleister Crowley, and these magical workings that he underwent with Hubbard and a number of others were designed um, to bring in Lady Babylon, the whore of Babylon. Um, so I mean, it makes you wonder. Uh, the super colliders that we're turning on and off right now, including not the least of which is CERN, but there are half a dozen operations around the world too, um, where some of the express goals are to try and contact other dimensions and see what resources are there that we might be able to use in this one. Um, Given all of the high strangeness and pageantry and that's been involved in the public side of CERN, these odd parades with pagan imagery and there's a statue of
Shiva.
Shiva, I think, yeah, outside of CERN. One has to question this strange marriage of science and magic, and what the implications are, what entities are involved in all of this, because I have talked to no end about the fact that science and magic are really just two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Um, Anthropologists have been writing about this for over 100 years, but um, and here we are. some of our most, let's say within the past 100 years, some of the most quintessential minds in our advancements in technology have also been involved in rather dark occultic things. Um, so one has to wonder if by all of these workings um, that some of these entities are not directly present in the world right now, and if not directly present, then they're at least in contact with the humans that are performing these rites and acts, um, all of which is disturbing. Um, to what end, are all of these advancements? Um, I have my own concerns about artificial intelligence. Well, I think that there are excellent uses for artificial intelligence. I'm really excited about what AI can do for ancient language decipherment and the library at Herculaneum. These scrolls that they're able to basically digitally lay out and preserve. Just amazing, remarkable things. But like anything, AI can also be weaponized and used to nefarious ends. One of the disturbing trends about AI, and this almost brings us full circle back to the Tower of Babel. One of the disturbing trends about AI is its use as a kind of um, a medium or oracle, because there are people who have actively tried to contact spiritual entities using artificial intelligence. And so, in a way, I mean, with artificial intelligence, what are we looking at here? We're looking at not just artificial intelligence, but even before that, the internet. We're sort of back at the threshold of Babel because we're close to all speaking the same language again, zeros and ones. The internet has made that possible. Artificial intelligence is making it possible at a faster speed, so that um, you would almost see an undoing of the so-called confusion of languages at Babel. So that are we at the stage now to where multiple magical workings like the Babel event can take place because of things like artificial intelligence?
Yeah. Um, and we will see how far we can go with it with artificial intelligence. As you said, there are aspects of artificial intelligence that I fully support and I find it useful,
Sure.
but there are other aspects that yeah, scare me. And also, they have already started some studies that people who, some people already have the habit that Grok or ChatGPT or whatever it might be, they answer every question for them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And already it is measurable that people are getting stupider.
Oh yes. Yeah. Because it works. I think that trend has been ongoing for a number of decades, um, largely because um, all of that is based on passive learning. And you can't master a topic or a subject just via passive learning.
Yeah.
Um, it's staggering too because our institutions are crumbling. Um, I'll never forget. When I was a professor at South Texas College, one of my duties was to teach a class of high school students who were taking the history class I was taking for college credit, and it was a complete disaster because they weren't ready for the rigor involved in a college level class. But the thing that I found most disturbing, um, and it was a big to do, we had to call in a number of meetings with the principal and the liaison of the college and our the chair of our department. We basically had to tell them, look, if you can't accommodate us, and have the students ready, then we can't do this. But what really troubled me is that there was an administrator in this high school who said, well, these kids don't have to learn how to write. The computer does it for them now.
Hmm. Oh, that is such a stupid attitude.
It's absurd. It's
Hmm.
it's absolutely absurd. Granted, computers are great in that respect, and that um, back in the day, if I was writing an article or a research paper or something, I had to have my style guide, for all my citations, and some of that I'd memorized, but it was always good to have that on hand. Now, at least in Word, APA, MLA, Chicago Manual Style, Turabian, all of those are built into so that you can use them to make your citations and footnotes and bibliography and whatnot. Um, but students and people in general should still know the process,
Yeah.
um, because as you say, it's not just conjecture; it's quantifiable that you know intelligence is decreasing and not increasing. It's not keeping pace with the advancement of our technology, um, and it makes me think of all the cautionary tales from science fiction. Orwell's 1984, but also Frank Herbert's Dune. The backstory to that is that humanity just turned all of their concerns over to robots and artificial intelligence, and it allowed a small group of technocrats to enslave all of humanity. Um, and one just has to wonder if we're not on a similar track, given the kinds of things we've been talking about today.
Hmm.